Today, I'm honored to introduce our guest, Victor Dover. Victor is a founding principal at Dover Coal Partners. He's a nationally recognized innovator and thinker in city planning, neighborhood design, street design, and his work's taken him around the globe, covering topics of livable communities, sustainable development, and he served as the national chair of the Congress for the New Urbanism. Victor's co-authored the breakthrough book Street Design to Great Cities and Towns, and I think is authoring his next book now. I think I'm at liberty to say that. Maybe pre-order. Go ahead and get that in. Victor's no stranger to Northwest Arkansas. His work has informed communities throughout our region for years, and he's currently working on a project in Rogers that I think you'll hear more about today. So with that, I welcome to the stage Victor Dover.
There's lots to worry about, as the video shows very clearly. But I am going to bring you some good news as well as we go along here, because I actually believe that you have a lot of room to build. You can accommodate the new generations of folks in Northwest Arkansas, but you can't do it if you leave design to the end. Design is not something extra that you can add on after all the big decisions are made by the lawyers and the engineers and what have you, but rather something that has to be part of how you approach land development from the very beginning, how you approach community making from the very beginning. And I'll try to talk a little bit about that this morning. I am going to take you all over the place because there's a whole lot to cover. Some of this is about housing and about neighborhood design, about transportation, about economics. I'm going to get as small as this front porch and that elevated finished floor and details like that. I'm going to get as big as where do we grow? Where can we grow? But I'm asking you to go with me on that journey as we veer back and forth across these many topics, because they're all connected to each other. And the essence of planning is that you have to think about a lot of things at one time. I am going to also challenge you to think about where there would have been room, if only. In our business, we work about half the time for local governments and community groups, about half the time for private developers and investors, not in the same place at the same time. But this makes us, or puts us in the situation of often having to be translators for how the others think. And when you get into those conversations, you discover that people thought there wasn't room or that they couldn't do something, but if only. This, for example, back in the background of that picture in Glenwood Park in Atlanta, you see the first live-work units built in Atlanta in the modern era. And of course, they were snapped up right away, and they're very popular parts of Glenwood Park, but that's partly because they tapped into decades of unmet demand, pent-up demand for that option among the many other kinds of housing options. So just that little thing on those little townhouse lots actually unlocked possibility for doing more things rather than fewer with the same postage stamp of land. And in the process also created zero commute housing where people could walk downstairs to their place of business. So I'll just share with you that big one on the end with the extra little fancy party space on the roof is the lawyer's house. No surprise, right? Law firm downstairs. But down the block, a skinny one with less height and less square footage and less corners and ends to finish off and everything, is the piano teacher's house, where the kids from the neighborhood go for their piano lessons after school. So that little thing, just saying, why don't we live and work on the same piece of land, took people off of the road at the regional peak times when you were all trying to get somewhere, if you were in Atlanta, and improved quality of life. Now, we travel a lot. We work all over the place. Thank you, Duke, for mentioning that we've been lucky enough to work in many communities now in Northwest Arkansas over a long period of time. And coming back here so often, I see a bunch of familiar faces in this room. Feels like homecoming. But traveling is actually not luxury. Working on projects that are farther from home changes our way of thinking. We come back to the next project with a greater sense of what is possible. Now, a theme in this presentation this morning is finding lost space. We like to joke that we're in the before and after business because we like to look at a picture of the way things are now and then imagine how they might be over time, with change over time. Regathering lost space, for example, in that case around a dead mall, there's room to build. And this principle has been with us for about 6,000 years of human experience in building towns. It's not a new idea. The scale varies. Not every place is Times Square or Hong Kong. Not every place is Mayberry. There are lots of alternatives in between all of those. But for a really long time, human beings have been setting up themselves on the land to come together and, when needed, closer together for our collective benefit, for security, for commerce, and because we're social beings, we like to be with other people and look at the other people. Now, these are Florida charts over here on the left, and you all do charts like this. I saw that the Workforce Housing Center has begun gathering the same kind of data. There's lots of good information on your website, Duke and Isabel. Thank you for the communication you're doing on this important issue. But this kind of chart, which shows what happens to households when they have to spend a disproportionate amount of their incomes on housing, are really important to me. And we picked up on, as of a couple of years ago, in Rogers, 53% was the average that households were spending on housing and transportation combined. It could be worse. In fact, in those Florida examples, it is worse. But that's too high by a bit. And it's partly because the housing cost is high, and that's partly because the per unit land cost has risen as your part of the world has been discovered and going through this unprecedented prosperity. Lots of people want to be here. No wonder when the supply is low and the demand is high, that prices rise. But what about that big number on transportation? Are we really doing everything we could do to shrink the combo of those two, housing and transportation? And why are so many people spending so much on just basic moving about from here to there? Now, so this idea of cost burden is a national issue. I want to reassure you that you are not alone in this. We did see the average household in Northwest Arkansas now, as of the 2021 figures, it's undoubtedly gotten worse in the last 2 years, is about $193,000. The average median home price, $326,000. Doesn't take a math major to figure out that that's a really big gap to close. And anybody who's tried to build a new high-quality house on an expensive piece of land for just $326,000 knows that is also super difficult. But you aren't alone. This is a national issue. It's happening everywhere. It used to be a coastal issue. I live in Greater Miami. Used to think that was just for us, or New Yorkers or something. But gradually, the whole country has now gotten to this point where 21 million Americans qualify as cost burdened. And their rents are rising faster than their incomes. So this gap is getting worse. And we probably aren't doing everything we could do to be closing it. Homelessness is also a motivator. The folks in Santa Monica will tell you that they realized, and the folks in Sacramento will tell you, that it became apparent to them, even to the richest among them, that something was off, that they have such a concentration of unhoused. 17 people for every 10,000 will experience homelessness at some point in their life. A much larger percentage, something like 17%, are not going out on their own and starting their own households because they're staying home with mom and paying off incredible student loan debt. So this is a national issue. A few years ago, national organization, the Smart Growth America and the Foreign-Based Codes Institute undertook a kind of audit of the land development code. Some of you probably read the report about this, and I think is it on your website too? Okay, so you can get it that way. Worth looking at. They were asked to look at the tier 1 cities in Northwest Arkansas. That's Fayetteville and Rogers, Springdale, and Bentonville. And they came away with some really important findings. By the way, the folks in Siloam and the folks in Johnson, they're right behind you, so it's not just the tier 1 issues. There are some encouraging things in what they found in their code audit. In fact, all of the municipalities have been undergoing land development regulation reform in order to get in there and solve for some of these problems. That was actually very encouraging. The densest places in town under the zoning codes are actually quite undense by national standards, which makes you wonder, why are we skipping over land and underutilizing it? Is it because people are nervous? The code review found that as a result of relatively recent reforms, to one degree or another, each of those cities has now gotten friendlier to the idea of mixing land uses, like I showed you in the first slide. Just the idea that you could build residential units of one form or another in commercial sites is relatively new and innovative change that was made. That's all good news. And then I started looking again, having come in and out of here for the last 25 years, I started getting on Google Earth and just wandering around Northwest Arkansas to see what had changed since the last time I was here, which was 6 months ago. And a lot has changed. Obviously, a lot is changing all the time. It is really profound. There's Rogers, there's Bentonville, that's the hotel down by the big curve. Here's a piece of Fayetteville that's been locked down into that format for a long, long time. It jumps off the screen at you how much land in these asphalt scabs of the commercial corridors is being used for so little human activity. And so when you're looking for room to build, I'm going to urge you to think there is one of the first places. Well, it also doesn't take very much time spent in the newspaper morgue to figure out that you are also like your national peer communities in other ways, which is this innate hostility toward the idea of denser housing. I have attended meetings in Northwest Arkansas in years past where people say the word apartments with their lips curled. I got some nods. Sounds like others have experienced this as well in the past. It is human nature to fear growth and change. In fact, as Americans, perhaps especially as folks in Arkansas, we've been conditioned to be suspicious of growth and change, to think that growth and change is going to make things worse rather than better. Just let that sink in for a second. Growth and change are going to make things worse rather than better. What's the conditioning that would make us think that? Well, we look around at the cow pasture or the cornfield that turned into an office park or a bland apartment complex or another shopping center with a big empty parking lot. And so we, like this old cartoon from Forbes says, we don't know what it is yet, but we know we're against it. We're just waiting for the rest of the announcement so we can complete our backlash campaign. It's an issue. And I do think that the most important thing to fix is not the codes. It's not even identifying where on the map you could build. It's probably breaking out of old habits. Restoring the public's confidence in the idea that growth and change can make things better rather than worse is one of those things. And restoring good habits in development and design of development. Years ago, for our friends in Fayetteville, we made this picture to illustrate how a place that looks pretty much like that still today, you might even recognize that corner, might look over time as it changes from before to after, as people add things to it, and as they modify the public realm between the buildings. Isn't it conceivable that we might end up changing places that are just a building here and there poking out of parking lots into a place where by design, community is thicker and closer together, but actually feels more charming, more worthy, and more livable as a result of the change? Now, I want to zero in on a few critical topics. You heard me say a minute ago, the per unit land cost. This is probably the most important phrase to realize, because you can't drive down the per unit land cost unless you can do more with the land, and that's the most important thing to do. And it's a huge factor. And it is astonishing to me, given that around the country there's been so many innovative breakthrough cases. This is one in Tennessee, of using attached housing. Whether it's the quaint townhouses of Georgetown or Alexandria or Savannah, or these modern ones, obviously an architecture school town. But the idea of attaching homes to one another, like you saw in the very first picture of Atlanta, not such a radical idea, and yet hardly found here. And is probably just waiting for someone to build good demonstrations of how nice it can be. Now, in your historic neighborhoods, you do have examples of multifamily buildings that are very dignified. Not enough of them. So the next place to look is what happened to the small apartment building? Not the giant complex on 30 acres with the chain link fence around it. with parking lots on all sides of all buildings, but just the simple small apartment building that's in the same neighborhood with the houses. This is in the Connecticut Avenue Northwest area of Washington. And over on the right, you see the rather abrupt transition to attached houses and single family detached houses on that same street. And then the multifamily building, which is quite tall, quite dense, quite up in your face. And yet the world did not come to an end. We used to know how to add these buildings to neighborhoods as they needed to densify, and we got away from that. And it's partly because we thought that to guarantee the results in planning, human beings briefly thought in the 20th century that the way to guarantee the results was to push things farther apart, to take the components of town and spread them out. The hope would be that if you keep the density low and the land uses separate enough, that the result would be that you'd minimize the impacts of one activity on another, and everybody would love you for it. And that is the essence of what happened in zoning. Very crude tools, blunt instruments, what they were once called. So that affects everything, because as soon as you decide to push everything farther apart instead of closer together, you're selling isolation. To the real estate professionals, I'll share with you the great thing I learned from Vince Graham, developer in the Low Country in South Carolina. He said, when you sell isolation, and that could be the big house on the big lot on the cul-de-sac, or it could just be the separating of all the land uses. When you sell isolation, then every time you add something, it takes away from what you're selling. So in the eyes of your buying populace, it makes things worse rather than better. If you sell isolation, it makes things worse. It takes away from what you're selling. But if you sell community, then every time you add something, it makes it better. Selling isolation is why the people in phase 1 turn out to oppose the completion of phase 4. Okay? Selling community is how you add something and have everybody go, oh, great, this is getting better and better. And so the whole premise of planning and zoning, of real estate law, of being a real estate broker, being a banker, being a real estate developer, all has to shift on that fundamental understanding. Now, so again, to look at a picture we drew for the Ozarks some years ago, when you just do a house here and a house there, like each one of them is a little house on the prairie, then that takes a lot of room. But if you could build a village, then it seems natural for things to be close together and natural for there to be country, not just town. So if you want to preserve your scenic backdrop, Grady, or preserve your natural systems in large-scale conservation, building more densely inside the town you've already got is the key to being able to do that. Now, what about going up? People always ask this. Actually, going up is really expensive. It is a thing we do at times, in the heart of the metropolis, let's say, in bigger cities. Not to rule out the possibility of tall mid-rise or high-rise construction, but it gets, and these are old numbers, it gets so much more expensive as you go up that this works against the very thing you were trying to solve for. So it's justifiable only in very limited circumstances. So let's go on a search for lost space. I'll give you an obvious one. As our communities change in their economic purpose, we begin to see land that was used once upon a time for one thing, and it becomes possible for something else. Well, the fairgrounds can become a new school campus and a new neighborhood, let's say. In the south side of Chattanooga, the industrial concerns that left the neighborhoods there, they were called Rustville. I'm not kidding. Rustville, that was the name of one of the neighborhoods. Fort Negley, everybody called it Fort Neglect, and Jefferson Heights. As Chattanooga got reviled in the national press as the dirtiest little city in America, and as they found themselves with a Sunbelt location and Rust Belt problems, they began to have to reinvent themselves. And they were very successful at reinventing the downtown, just north of the area in color, while the south side continued to languish. When we first got there in the late 90s, it was literally a smoldering ruin. This building was on fire the day before. And there were remnants, historic buildings here and there, lots and lots of vacant property. But the Main Street, and it's called Main Street, had all the buildings boarded up. Now, I don't mean 90% of the buildings, because Ward Davis, I knew you would call me on the math if I got that wrong, right? I mean 100% of the buildings on Main Street south of the Chattanooga Choo-Choo were boarded up and underutilized. And so this is the way we found it. So we went to work on a design-oriented approach to bringing it back. This required a lot of lead work by the Lyndhurst Foundation, the Benwood Foundation, other philanthropic pioneers really come into this area. But very quickly, they began to use this lost space. So finding lost space in the old industrial part of town that needed a new purpose, and it really worked. They connected new streets. They planted new street trees, like real street-like streets. Let that sink in. And they built a lot of housing. Basically, the foundations got in there. They did all the difficult and expensive pre-development front work that individual investors weren't finding time to do. It was just easier to do sprawl on the edge of town or out on Lookout Mountain. So they got in there and they went and hand built all those permissions, all those zoning waivers and exceptions and platting tasks and so on, and then let builders build individual homes. And the artists, cyclists came, the artists, the cyclists, and the historic preservationists are the shock troops of revitalization. And the artists started dragging rusty stuff out of those vacant buildings and welding it together and making amazing things. And now the South Side is a really different place. After a while of reestablishing confidence, that it became possible to restore historic buildings. And that started there, a great Cajun restaurant in there. And then build new buildings. This is now the Main Street again. They have an actual butcher and an actual baker within walking distance of your home. This old derelict building became the best restaurant in Chattanooga. And the South Side, now rebranded as that, sounds better than Russville, right? Is the place to be in Chattanooga. To a point where every day, there's another headline about people doing something amazing, another boutique hotel or another headquarters or more housing or what have you. What they don't have in the South Side is a whole lot of permanently affordable housing because they were discovered. And they didn't listen in 1997. We said, eventually you're going to have an affordable housing problem here. I think the answer then was, I'll believe it when I see it, and what a great problem to have. But so now they are finding themselves needing more tools, like a community land trust and so on, in order to get more affordable housing baked in. So all over the country, we're now seeing rediscovery of these pockets of lost space. There's one in downtown Atlanta. But what do we have more of than anything else? Remember Kmart? Remember Circuit City? Remember Sports Authority? Remember Lennon's and things? You can just go down the list. We have a lot of those. This is an old dead Kmart. What could we do if we could peel back some of the asphalt from these places and rethink their purpose? I mean, one way to reuse it is just to turn it into an Amazon fulfillment center and have a bunch of small trucks zipping in and out of it. That's not the only thing you could do. But look at the capacity for growing neighborhood at a neighborly scale that's not the tall, expensive buildings and not overwhelming to the adjacent neighborhood. Amazing capacity in these spaces. And so I hope as you all leave this building, you drive around wherever you're going from here and you look around and you say, oh, there is a lot of space between the buildings. And there is a lot of this underutilized commercial land. It isn't just the huge shopping center sites like that old dead Kmart. It's the smaller parcels as well, where one of those small or a little bit bigger multifamily or mixed-use developments could be inserted, if only. And now we get back to the rules. If only the rules permitted it. If only you could satisfy the setbacks and the parking requirements and so on. So everywhere we look, America does have a plentitude of one thing, and that is dead malls, dead shopping centers, long corridors that are remain great transportation routes, and therefore potentially great addresses for a lot of people. And there's a vast capacity in these places for doing just this. So Amherst, New York commissioned this study to see what could be done with the old dead mall. Developer from Washington got on the plane, landed in Buffalo, went over there, paid for it, bought that property, is building this. So I think a lesson from the story is, if you want to find your lost space, you have to visualize what it could be. Now, looked at the maps to see where there was still land that hadn't already been redesignated for mixed use. Like, so excluding now the mixed use Main Street kind of downtown areas, and just looking at the vast areas of zoning for generally one or other of commercial uses by themselves. Your big corridors, these that especially along the monster streets, are full of such sites. Some of them have been built. Some of them are waiting to be built. Still, a huge percentage of the land inside your 4 Tier 1 communities devoted to commercial-only uses. That's really high, 23%. It's really, really high compared to your peer cities around the country. Now, there's no exact hard rule of how much land is the right amount of land to reserve for commerce. There is an answer. The answer is it depends, obviously. And there are places which have 50% of their land area devoted to commerce. And there are places that have 0.5% devoted to commerce. But somewhere between 4 or 6 or 10% would seem typical and balanced. And you have a vast amount. It makes me think not just of the land where there already is a shopping center or there already is an office park, but the land where it's anticipated that the corridors will be extended and growth will occur, and that there's an imperative to make sure that some of that growth is in storefront businesses with cash registers ringing for all the tax-based implications of that. So I'll show you this exciting one. Call this a soft rollout, John, because we really haven't had a chance to show this to folks. John Schmelsley and Kristen Bozeman asked us to look at this beautiful site the Warren family owns in Rogers. And if you know the area, development all around it, but it's in the natural path of the extension of Pinnacle Hills Parkway. And the presumption in the Rogers comprehensive plan is that the northern end of this site will be a neighborhood center with some substantial mixed uses and non-residential components. So we started taking a hard look at that. We commandeered John and Kristen's conference room for a while and dragged the engineers in there and started drawing what-if plans for what could be. And I became increasingly excited about it. I think it might end up being a breakthrough design example when we're done. 197 acres, which is actually quite big. So we decided to do scale comparisons with other communities you might know in places you may have visited just to see. The conclusion is 197 acres is room for a whole lot of city building. You can do a lot there. And so that circle is a half-mile radius. So 20 minutes walk from one end to the other. It really cleaves itself naturally into 2 neighborhood sites. So what I want you to see here is that before we started laying land uses on the property and before we started counting up housing, we started thinking of it as neighborhoods. And then gradually worked our way into a pattern of blocks and streets and green spaces and building sites that would reflect what the land naturally wants to be. This is all premised on the idea that Pinnacle Hills Parkway can be extended as a livable street, a beautiful street, instead of a monster street. Okay. I'll just share with you, the northern end is on the left and the southern end is on the right. And I'm also excited about the possibility to showcase a lot of variety here. So building more densely on part of the land so we can save the rest doesn't mean everything has to be super dense. For example, the northern end would end up with a lot of perimeter block kind of development and significant residential and non-residential uses. And the southern end can be much more relaxed, like the surrounding suburban communities and the small branches that are existing on the southern end. So yes and yes, both and, not either or. Parts of this property can be targeted for very large houses. We're very lucky people. Kristen calls them the lottery winners. That as a real estate broker, she often finds herself trying to find a place where they can live. So sure, large houses on large lots, that's part of the mix. But then as we move into the hearts of the neighborhoods and further on to the north, into the classic American garden streets, which have street trees and front porches, relatively shallow setbacks in front yards, and are relatively closer together. And as we keep going toward the center of the neighborhood and toward the north, these things can come closer together. The buildings eventually attach to one another. And then along a future extension of Pinnacle Hills Parkway, a main street. So what if? This is our first chance to really test this with anybody, so send in your comments. Um, I think that what we realized was that if you're careful about where how close to build um, you build, then that will leave you with land between the buildings for more than just streets and parking. You can actually make great public spaces out of utilitarian stormwater infrastructure and the like. So Warren Park's one to watch. This is going to be an interesting test. Rogers has been, retooling their land development regulations for years now, and we're making an earnest effort to reflect all of those things. So you can get an example built that hopefully will be useful for all of the examples in all the municipalities in the area. Now, what are the other ways, apart from finding lost space and capturing those remaining remnants, like the one I showed you on Warren Park, for more rather than less? One of the ways is just to remember that we always grew variety in organically grown neighborhoods. This one, kind of great example. The building on the right is fairly fancy, fairly big. The building in the middle of the picture, fairly modest, narrow lot, but 2 stories. And then to its left, that little white building is the cottage, where it has a 0-step entrance. So that little piece of that one street in that one neighborhood allows for all kinds of households to fit in. And even the small house has the dignity necessary that comes from a great building to street relationship. And this is the design problem, of course, is that even if it's a small unit, it should have that dignity. So we attempt to implement that whenever we can and put it on display. One place where you can see it is in the Wheeler district in Oklahoma City. How many of you have been to Wheeler? There's one. Here's one. Worth going to take a look. It's growing out of once the airport, or an old municipal executive airport, right in the middle of town. And so no trees. So everything has to hide in plain sight. It called for the design to be extra special so that you wouldn't be able to tell where real estate development left off and public art picked up. But they could all be one thing. And so you can now see some of that being demonstrated in the Wheeler district. One of the things that they have in Wheeler is more of those live-work units. So they're testing in the same way that Atlanta did 15 or so years ago. They're testing these so-called shop houses or shop homes, where you pay one rent or one mortgage and you get a place for your small business downstairs. And that's proven very popular in the first phase, to the point where the developer said, let's do some more in the second phase. Very encouraging. Then there's the accessory dwelling units, or granny flats, in-laws quarters, a topic of, I know, years of conversation here in Northwest Arkansas. Good for Fayetteville, updating their ordinance to make it the national example, really, of the best ADU ordinance. And of course, finding, after retooling the ordinance, making some tweaks in that, making it feasible instead of infeasible. Guess what? People are using it, which is great news. And I think all over the country, people are watching Fayetteville's experiment. Hopefully the other communities will follow suit. Now, what about this one? How's that for a parking lot? This is a corner surface parking lot where the owners figured out that they could put studio apartments above some of the spaces. Ivy covers some walls. There it is from above. So the parking lot goes right under that building. That there are small, affordable, small square footage, close in town, workforce housing, and it looks really good. So there it is from another angle, so you can see how that worked. But what I'm getting at here in this, reminding you to find the lost space, is that there's actually room if you're just willing to undertake the effort and think about it by design. Well, what about building not giant complexes of a lot of things at once to get those economies of scale, but building a few things, a few at a time, small at a time? There's also vast capacity for incremental development. Someone should do a map of all the vacant lots. I've found quite a few on my quick scan in all 4 of your tier 1 cities. You have room to build. And getting people to get inspired about that is probably should be priority number 1. I've loved the leadership that's been provided by the Incremental Development Alliance in promoting a new generation of small and local builder developers how to do this, how to make it work. Bernice Radel on the far right, my favorite example. All right, then there's this inevitable need for multifamily, not tall, because that's too expensive. Not a few units at a time because we need the economies of scale. The garden apartments that you probably see and maybe barely tolerate or even loathe that are scattered around the country actually are a fundamental development type that can be reformed. And some of the design errors are so obvious. Well, first, if there are no streets, you're not doing it right. Because a real neighborhood has streets. It has blocks and streets and interconnectedness and walkability. And really, there's no reason why the folks who live in apartments shouldn't enjoy those same things. So if your format, no matter what the architecture, I didn't count up all the materials here. I stopped at like 7 materials on the facade. Instead of trying to applique your way out of the problem, don't do buildings poking out of parking lots. Now, history is full of examples of how to build these bigger, efficient garden-style buildings. The garden-style apartment, a building type, emerged from the Garden City movement. Places like Letchworth, Forest Hills Gardens in New York, you know that example. And if you go back in their historic drawings, the architects tackled the problem of the big, long building and the double-loaded, thick building, the breezeway-served building. And I think we can learn a lot from looking at those. We took a typical floor plan of a basic 24-unit garden apartment recently and started operating on it. So we laid it on the operating table, cut it open, and started adjusting it. First thing we did was we put it on a street so that it had at least one side of the building close to the street and then a conversational distance between its front porches that we added and the sidewalk, the rest of the parking in the back. That's the very first move. Make street-oriented buildings rather than parking lot buildings. And you might just get people a lot more tolerant of the idea of denser building. Then here's the before and after of the elevation. I'll let you choose. Which one do you think? But it's not that difficult. You just fix proportions so that the window openings are vertical and fix the dimensions so that the porches are deep enough to stand on, if they exist at all. And actually, it's a salvageable building type. And there are a few other things like working it onto the land so that you can have an elevated finished floor. That building's going to be close to a sidewalk. Then you want the occupants inside that building to have privacy, and you want people walking by on the sidewalk to feel comfortable doing so. So elevating the finished floors, really basic thing. Immediately makes you say, wait a minute, what about visibility? What about accessibility? These are breezeway served buildings. There's actually no problem as long as the other side, where the parking lot is zero step. So the young lady you see right there could be pushing a wheelchair into the front of the building on the street side. And then, of course, step up from the building and start to put them together in a set so that they look like a place when you're done. Think about the vista down the street and what you're going to see at the end of the street, adjusting to the topography. That kind of thing. So there's the multifamily. This is an example that we're working on in North Carolina. There are beautiful new examples of multifamily that have all the dignity I've been talking about. Here's an example, newly constructed. It's garden-style multifamily, and it works. I'll point you to an example in Central Florida called Baldwin Park. Some of you may have visited it. And it has a little bit of everything. It has a main street, has row houses that I mentioned before. It has multifamily in a pattern of blocks and streets. And when they came to do the apartments, they did just what I described. They elevated the finished floor. So as you walk by, you feel comfortable here. You might look through the open curtains and see someone's chandelier, but you're not going to see them sitting on their couch and what they're watching on television. So that's a pretty important change. And how do you do it? You just think about your grading ahead of time so that you're working your site plan and you're grading so that the parking lot side, the alley side, the middle of the block, the utilitarian side of such a building can provide for zero-step entries. Now, so this is an example in Texas. Here's another a couple of Texas examples. I guess I have to say it. If they can do it in Texas, you can do it. Okay. Let's talk about the streets themselves. Now, here's houses that are built very close together, and they have a lower per unit land cost as a result, and more would fit on the land when we can be strategic about where to use a narrower lot. How did they do that? And wait a minute, where's the street? This is another example from Baldwin Park. They literally just left the street out and they made it a green space instead. these houses are served by alleys on the rear service lanes, and so the street side became an even better, greener public space. It's peeled back the asphalt from their site plan. The dimensions, building face to building face, are just like the regular streets, but they strategically, in a couple of places, just made them green instead. I think it turned out brilliant. By the way, don't let anybody tell you that the alleys have to be gross or that they're a big problem, especially if you just saved all that money on the street design, right? So here's the alley behind the house I just showed you. Here's another section of that same alley. Not gross. Perfectly normal component to traditional neighborhood design. Somehow lost. We got out of the habit of doing it. But if we recover it, we can fit a lot of things close together. At the beginning, I spoke about thinking of housing and transportation as a composite number. I'm sure you probably have seen maps like this one. This was the year 2000 in the area around the District of Columbia. And you're looking at a map that color codes for the transportation cost as a percentage of income. And then here that is in 2008. So very rapid change. What's interesting to me is that in the years since this map was first produced, Washington has gotten to be an easier and easier place to live without a car, to the point where a majority of households don't have one anymore and still live a very high quality of life. So in housing activism, I would urge you to think about housing and transportation together, not separately. Because you can do some things about the housing cost, but when you've exhausted all your tools, you need to be working on the transportation things that you can also control. Well, part of it is where you do it. These charts compare the amount of disposable income remaining to a household if they live in a location-efficient location where you can walk, bike, use transit, or make short car trips, versus if you live in a totally auto-dependent place. You want to solve for the problem of Northwest Arkansas's growth and change? Make Northwest Arkansas into a car-optional place. And that means building closer together. And you have to make it beautiful for people to let you do that, which is why I'm pushing so hard on design. It's not just the cost of their vehicle, the cost of their insurance, it's also the cost of energy, and all of the implications that go with that. So we look at maps as gas prices go up and down and realize that volatility also affects everything. But the conclusion is that households near transit spend less on their transportation, and that is one of the things you can work on. So how do you expand the transportation menu? Well, first, recognize that most trips are fairly short and close to home. Probably a majority of the 10 to 14 car trips per household your home produces are actually 2 miles or 5 miles or less. A lot of those could be converted to short trips on the neighborhood network or walking and biking and transit trips, if only we set it up that way. We ask audiences all the time, are you making car trips now that you would rather make by walking and biking if only there was a safe, beautiful way to walk and bike? And the answer is always a vast majority of people think about it. However, the way we build infrastructure often looks like driving is the only normal thing to do. That, you build the road as if the only way you're supposed to move around is driving. Guess what people do? If Gabe Klein put it this way: people use the infrastructure you build. If you build highways and parking lots, people drive. If you build beautiful tree-lined sidewalks and transit systems, people walk and bike and use transit. So that is part of it. So walking does sound radical. I put a question mark on there so that in case you were doing that in your head, saying, what? Walkable streets? And the answer is yes. This is what's crazy, even though this is what's typical. We can make walkable streets, and that means getting back into the before and after thing I started with, thinking about how we can modify the streets that are scary to use as a pedestrian or a cyclist into places that aren't scary to use. Why do I think it can be done? Because I've seen it. Meredith and I worked together on a street in West Palm Beach, which at one time looked like this. It actually looked even worse than this at one time. And now it looks like this. It was put on a diet and then put on a diet again to bring it down to two-way traffic and slow, and at times even closed to traffic. And now it's like the community's living room again. And there's room for trees and room for outdoor dining, a component in a car optional neighborhood. Now I have a long list. I won't make you see them all. but of how you would build a car optional neighborhood on some of that lost space. So let's go back to Chattanooga for a second. Here's one of their industrial properties, which had basically fenced off the people of Chattanooga from the riverfront for about 150 years. And that, as the industry left and wasn't coming back, it became possible to rethink it as Chattanooga's first 20th century, or let's say 21st century, car optional neighborhood. Rule number one, build things closer together, like we started with. And that means anticipating variety in the public spaces. When you attach the houses, make it seem like a great thing that you did that. It means peeling back the asphalt that may have been laid there and is no longer needed for its original purpose. Go see the empty parking lots in Northwest Arkansas on the day after Thanksgiving if you want a proof of what I'm talking about. Second is building walkable streets and bikeable streets. That's not too difficult. It's not rocket science. People like street trees. People like slow-moving streets so that the cars and trucks and the people on foot can interact. What about small blocks? To lay out the blocks in the network in your plan, like the one in Warren Park, so they're relatively small. You can get around them. Every great city in history has been done that way. And so in Chattanooga, it was just simply a matter of extending the traditional street grid from the old part of town into the new part of this space. And then what about starting with the green parts? Require first the street-oriented architecture that I showed you with the apartments, and then face that with green public spaces. If you lay out your neighborhood plan with the green spaces first and then fit the real estate development to it, everybody will love you for it. If you start with the pro forma and the numbers and the quantity of parking spaces required by the zoning, comply with everything, and then see where you can fit in some open space, people will still hate you for it. So it is that simple. Number 5, plant street trees, then plant some more. Number 6, connect to the surroundings, and in this case with high quality bike infrastructure. So what you're seeing there is the creation of a phenomenal portion of their Blue Goose Hollow Trail. Number 7, optimizing for new mobility. That means a lot of things. It means smaller vehicles, it means transit vehicles, it means on-demand ride share, it means the scooters and the e-bikes. It means small fleets of shared cars that are in the downstairs of your apartment or your student housing instead of everybody having to own their own and pay for it. Yes, it means autonomous vehicles, but low tech, it also means doing some things the great old ways they used to be done. I will invite you to challenge yourself to, every time you now go on a trip and you look out of your hotel room, to visualize how much of that is parking. A lot of it, in almost every case. I showed this picture in Atlanta, and the folks there said, well, Victor, you got that wrong. That building in the middle, that's also parking. So just imagine what would happen if even a small percentage of the parking demand in urban areas was to go away as a result of Uber and Lyft and walking and biking and autonomous vehicles and so on. We find often that transit-oriented development is really parking-oriented development, and that's fixable. Why do I think this is so important? The Econ 101 message again, parking is really, really costly. And if it has to be in a structure, or under buildings, or underground, it's even more costly. So why not put showers in your workplace, add covered secure bike parking at that same workplace, and encourage people that way instead of driving? Well, that's all feasible. So reimagining the workplaces themselves, a lot of that's going on. It's not that hard to imagine doing it with showers. And last, the idea of thinking, whenever you're working in one neighborhood, it's actually connected to the larger region as a economic unit, right? So you want to be able to go from here to there using whatever means is most appropriate. And that probably means setting the place up around locations where you can quickly and easily change from one mode of travel to another, from walking to the bus or from the bus to the e-scooter and so on. So I'll leave you with some things you can do to, no matter who you are. There's always something you can do. First, employers. If you will recognize that the gap in the rise of rents that's outpacing the rise in incomes is really at the root of the problem, one of the things you can work on is wages. But there's more than that. You can also think about where to build. That gap keeps getting bigger. Well, what about thinking of the property you're planning to develop itself as a employee recruitment and retention tool. What you're looking at here is congregate care, skilled nursing housing for elderly seniors, and housing for the healthcare providers and that work there on the same land. Why is that important? Because if you don't do it there, they'll have to drive an hour from far away with all the costs and all the harm that that does to them. Well, what about the developers? There's a lot you can do. Call me, I'll help you. But the first is just sit down and do the math. Do the math of whether you really are exploiting the opportunity fully. What did we find when we looked at the zoning code in all 4 top tier towns? That people were building at far lower densities than the zoning permits, over and over and over. That's all about the habits. I would also say to those who are or want to be developers, look again at those incremental development folks. There's Bernice Radel again, who's worked on turning the lights back on her neighborhood, one building at a time, made it her mission to turn them from derelicts into works of art. And if she can do it, you can do it. What about the folks who get elected to office with absolutely no training in land development, real estate, economics, planning, or any of that? There's a lot you can do. But the first thing is to encourage your staff, encourage the people who are making plans to do the work, make the map, figure out where you'd be willing to accept change and promote it there. A lot of the drawings in our portfolio have to do with an elected official having popped up and said, we need to figure out how to solve this problem and where we can solve it. So you won't be able to start with the regulations unless you start with those visualizations about what it should be like when you're done. But as elected officials, there's always reform to be made. I really encourage there are lots of things that are done. What about the folks who work in government agencies? Haven't thought there'd be something for everybody in this. Well, I'm going to say the same thing again. You have to make the plan to work the plan. Everybody gets frustrated about plans that sit on the shelf. You realize the truth is planning is a verb. You got to do it, you got to do it again. And bring it back out and show it to people. For ordinary citizens, the most important thing is not to be the person who's waiting for the billboard to be completed so you can announce what you're out there stop. But to participate hands-on in the shaping of the future of your community, and to have hard conversations with your neighbors in diplomatic ways to find common ground. Here's the question I'll leave you with. You are in an unbelievable, unprecedented period of prosperity here in this part of the world. This is not the apple growing backwater it used to be 100 years ago. It's the amazing Northwest Arkansas juggernaut. In other words, you're exactly like Rochester was when Kodak was new, and you're exactly like Buffalo was when the Erie Canal and electrical power on the Niagara Falls was new. And they were the richest communities in our country. And with the prosperity that they built up, they built beautiful, livable neighborhoods. They built basilicas and opera houses and parks and things that everybody who lives in those towns now still enjoys, even though their period of being on top has ended. Those things are all there. So what will you do with your prosperity? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Victor.
Put my email address up there, so anybody who wants to call and write and complain about anything I just said, by all means.
Get book updates too. I think we have time for a question or two. Are there any?
Great. Right. So did everybody hear that question? The question is, what about utilities? People say it's too expensive to put them underground. Well, first of all, underground should be the default setting in new development. All right. I live in hurricane country. I know you all live through some pretty amazing ice storms, and I've been here for some of those. So you know what a drag it is on everybody to have to rebuild your grid after an event. And so underground utilities should be the norm for new development. Does that mean it all has to be super expensive? Well, what makes it expensive is when you try to jam everything into the same small space and you're working to satisfy each utility provider's requirements for depth and separation. So, but if, for example, you have that alley I showed you from Baldwin Park, well, then you've got a place for the dry utilities that's not right next to the wet utilities that are on the other side, on the street side. And all of it just gets a lot easier to implement those things. Last, we often get asked about undergrounding existing overhead wires. And it is very expensive. And some of them aren't the kinder, gentler little distribution lines that come to your house. Some of them are the big, nasty, humming transmission lines, high voltage, and those are very difficult to do anything about. There may be one or two places where it's such a precious location that you're willing to gel cool the conduit and what have you, but generally speaking, the big transmission lines are not going underground. You can, however, shape your development around them. We have one of those lines running right across the Warren Park property, so that you won't see it. You won't have to worry about it. It won't be in your face, and your kids will be away from the electromagnetic fields and so on. So that's a design problem. Again, on new development, not such a big deal. But what about those existing little distribution lines? One thing we learned is that the cost to relocate them to the rear instead of burying them in the front is 1/12 the cost of burying them. So one of the workarounds that is possible in some locations is to simply move them rather than putting them underground. But I'm glad that's great. That's a detail. I love that kind of question. And so there's always something you can do. And it's not the same answer in every context.
Any other questions?
Housing.
Yes, Tiffany.
Sure. Yeah, and it's a perception that goes far beyond the lived experience, even though you did live it. And I think it's partly how alleys fell out of favor. Just the word alley has this kind of Hollywood connotation of being a place where bad, notorious things happen. Wouldn't want to be caught down a blind alley with that crowd, or that is a phrase, right, in our culture. And so that's why I showed a couple of pictures of pretty benign alleys. The lessons from Jane Jacobs 60 years ago was what she called eyes on the street. The idea that doors and windows and storefronts and balconies overlooking public space made them safer. The potential miscreant in the street would look around and say, if I do something bad here, somebody's likely to see me, and I might get caught. And that is a behavior modification that comes from having doors and windows facing the street. So she called that eyes on the street. I think you can extend that. Eyes on the park, eyes on the alley. So in Glenwood Park, for example, the developer's bride, who's a lovely woman, was really nervous about more alleys in Atlanta. And what we did is we designed them so that there is no place where there aren't eyes on the alley. First, we got permission, and it was hard to get permission for those accessory dwelling units. And then we positioned them so that there was always somebody's balcony overlooking wherever you were standing on any of those alleys that rib the plan for Glenwood Park. And when she saw that, she said, okay, we can try that. And there have been no problems. That I think is, there's no magic cure-all for any of this, but again, if you have streets, and there are streets in Bentonville look exactly like what I'm describing, that are just garage door after garage door, and the houses are all turning toward their backyards, and those garage snouts that stick out on the fronts of the houses, those are essentially blank walls, providing no eyes on the street. And so I'm more scared on that street that something bad is going to happen to me or the occupants of that home than I am from the alleys in Glenwood Park.
It's Sterling. Go ahead. Yeah.
The last one. Uh-huh. Hey? Sure. So did everybody hear it? Did you hear it from way over there? The question was, um, if Canada is setting such a great model and places like Vancouver look beautiful, but they have the highest housing prices of anywhere, what can we learn from that experience in Northwest Arkansas? Is that fair phrase? Okay. Well, I think there's a lot there. And first of all, remember that Vancouver is a destination move to place like you have become here, where there has been for decades running immense pressure. All those people moving from Hong Kong, for example, after the Chinese took back over, came with a lot of capital and the ability to run prices up and a huge population growth and demand. And nothing succeeds like success, as you've experienced here. So more people want to come in behind that and get in on it. And so I think one thing you can take away is that you need to work the problem, but you need to think of it as one that you're going to manage, not necessarily solve. And that you need to keep inventing and bringing new tools to the game, not assuming you're going to flick a switch and it's going to work. Now, Tokyo had the same issue. They had a cooling of their economy. So let's be realistic about the pace of their demand for growth, declining a bit. But in Tokyo, they built a ton of housing. They liberalized the permission to add a great deal of housing. And they actually got to the point where they had so much market influence that now Tokyo is a relatively affordable place to live among world capitals. So part of the answer is, whether you're in Vancouver or Northwest Arkansas or in Tokyo, build your way out of the problem. If you don't add any units, don't be surprised if there isn't affordable housing. But don't leave here thinking that even if you do everything right, the problem will magically go away. And at this point, we are running triage in runaway housing price in Northwest Arkansas, to the point where you need to do everything you can and still understand that it's going to get worse before it gets better. I think that's now, if housing prices are inevitably rising because supply and demand works like that, then and you're adding supply but you can't add it fast enough, housing prices will continue to rise. And that's why I say make sure you're doing everything else so that the remaining household costs are under control. Add all this housing and not add a legitimate transit system so that everybody has to not only afford that expensive house, but also afford $10,000 or more a year on a modest sedan. You're just worsening the problem. So hopefully you're working on the transportation menu I talked about at the same time. And then you say, all right, households that are living with very high housing costs and lots of other costs, the cost of childcare, cost of student loans, it's not just one issue we're trying to play whack-a-mole with here, right? Even as you're working those problems, are you making it a more livable place? Are you increasing quality of life, like increasing the amount of time young parents can spend with children at home, for example, as opposed to spending it on their commute? What about if you're not going to have as many lucky lottery winners that have the big yards and big spaces to play outside their house? What are you doing to make sure they have really good places that are shared common open space? It's where the pocket neighborhoods and cottage courts become a really valuable thing. You don't get very much lot, but you get a shared garden and it's beautiful and awesome. A great place to be with your children or your grandparents. So I think that's what I meant when I said it's all connected. Hopefully you're working the whole problem.
And maybe time for one more. Did you have a question? Mm-hmm. The question is about short-term rentals, how to shape policy to address the issues raised with them, especially to the extent that they're worsening the problem of attainable housing. Well, I'm sounding like a little bit like a broken record here, but we're back to the supply and demand problem. If you start inordinately limiting the possibility that someone who's adding 2 accessory dwellings can use one of them as a short-term rental, you're cutting their income. So you're making it less likely that they can build that second ADU and satisfy grandpa or the abuela on that same lot. So I recommend
a more flexible rather than less flexible approach. The short-term rentals are having pressure on highly desirable neighborhoods and places with a lot of people coming in for short periods of time. But they are a much bigger threat to your hotel industry than they are to neighborhood quality of life or housing price, as real as those issues are. And so I look back at the other side of it and say, well, what is the future of the hotel industry, for example, in the face of all that competition from short-term rentals? And you realize that is another, just like housing, that's another highly regulated industry that with a little flexibility could probably do more with their land rather than less. Their creativity is clamped down, for example, by high minimum parking requirements. I learned in planning school that and it was burned into my brain, you're supposed to make sure you provide 0.75 parking spaces per hotel room key. That's the number. And if you have hotel ballroom space and gathering, conference space and that sort of thing, you might need more, like 1.25 parking spaces per hotel room key. Do you know what the hotels need now with Uber and Lyft bringing so many people from the airports? 0.3 and dropping. It's been dropping every year for the past 6 years, primarily because people that, like me, used to show up in town, rental car, and come to their one meeting and go to their one restaurant and then drive back to the airport, and they needed a parking space at the hotel. But now, a lot of people, not everybody, but a lot of people will get off the curb at baggage claim and get in a car share. They don't need a parking space at the hotel. So are you allowing the hotel companies that are struggling to keep those buildings full in the first place permission to do everything with their land they could be doing, if not for the inordinately high minimum parking requirement? I would hope so. So again, this isn't it's all connected answer. Don't just solve the short-term rentals issues by looking at short-term rentals. Look at the whole ecosystem of land uses in the neighborhood and the whole of the land, because you'll probably discover there's a lot of gray space that could be used for something else. Thank
Great.
you all very much.
Victor, thank you so much. Let's give him one more round of applause. Thank you. That's perfect. As I mentioned, this is the first of 5 speakers we're going to bring to our region, so look for more to come, and we'll do this party again a few more times this year. Everyone, stay dry. Have a great day. Thanks for coming.